Good evening, and welcome back to another quiet journey into the hidden corners of human history. Perhaps you're listening in the hush of your bedroom, the lights dimmed, letting the rhythm of words settle around you. Perhaps you're somewhere between waking and dreaming, searching for something steady to hold on to as the day fades. Wherever you are, and however you've come to this story, I invite you to listen slowly, to let the past rise gently from the shadows. Tonight, we travel not to the London alehouses of plague years, but to a place where silence and hunger became daily companions. A city locked in ice and fire, surrounded by armies, where ordinary people discovered what it truly meant to endure. This is the story of the Siege of Leningrad. When you hear the word siege, you might imagine castles, drawbridges, and ancient catapults. But the siege we are about to step into was not a medieval memory. It happened in the 20th century, in a modern city, with electric lights, trams, libraries, concert halls, and millions of people. And then, almost overnight, all of that civilization was cut off from the world, trapped in a circle of death that would last for almost 900 days. The date was September 8, 1941. German forces had swept across the Soviet Union in one of the largest invasions in human history. Their plan was clear: capture Leningrad, starve its people, and erase the city from the map. They did not intend to occupy it. They intended to destroy it. Leningrad was not just another city. It was the former imperial capital of Russia, home to palaces, museums, and the famous Hermitage. It was a city of poets, painters, and scientists. It was also an industrial powerhouse, producing tanks, weapons, and supplies vital to the Soviet war effort. To take Leningrad was to strike a blow not only against the Soviet army, but against the spirit of the Soviet people. When the German armies cut the last rail line into the city, when the last road was closed, Leningrad became an island. 2.5 million civilians were trapped inside, along with soldiers and workers. The city's fate was sealed: survive without food, without fuel, without escape, or die. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of that silence falling. No more trains carrying bread from the countryside. No more trucks bringing coal to heat the homes. No more letters arriving from loved ones far away. Only the knowledge that an army stood beyond the city limits, its artillery pointed inward, its orders clear. At first, there was disbelief. How could a city of such size, of such importance, be abandoned to its fate? Surely the blockade would be lifted in days, weeks at most. But days became weeks, and weeks became months. The people of Leningrad soon realized they were not waiting to be rescued. They were waiting to see how long they could endure. Food supplies ran out quickly. The city had not been prepared for such a siege. Flour, meat, sugar, oil, all were rationed. And as autumn turned to winter, the rations grew smaller and smaller, until they reached levels that could barely sustain life. Adults received 250 grams of bread a day. Children, only 125 grams. And even that bread was not truly bread. It was a dark, heavy mixture, bulked with sawdust, cellulose, and whatever filler could be found. People stood in endless lines in the cold, clutching ration cards like treasures. Fights broke out over crumbs. Those who worked in bakeries were watched with suspicion, for they held the keys to life itself. And still the rations shrank. People boiled wallpaper to scrape out the paste, which contained flour. They fried belts and leather shoes to soften them into something chewable. Cats and dogs vanished from the streets, caught and eaten. Even glue was consumed, melted down and swallowed, though it poisoned as much as it sustained. The winter of 1941 was one of the coldest in memory. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees. Fuel was gone. Electricity failed. Pipes froze solid, leaving no water. People melted snow in buckets indoors, waiting hours for a few drops. Trams stopped running. Factories closed. Entire apartments stood in darkness, their windows sealed with boards against the icy wind. In that silence, people listened to the groaning of the river ice, the distant thunder of artillery, and the hollow sound of their own stomachs. It is one thing to read about hunger in numbers. It is another to hear the testimony of those who lived it. One woman, writing in her diary, described how her hands shook so violently she could not hold a spoon. Another recalled how she spent entire days lying in bed, too weak to rise, staring at the ceiling, waiting for nightfall. Children swelled with edema, their bellies bloated, their legs like sticks. Mothers hid food from their children, because instinct told them survival required calculation, not mercy. And yet, somehow, many kept living. Death became the city's constant companion. In the streets, bodies lay frozen where they had fallen. Horse carcasses were stripped within hours, every scrap of flesh taken. Funerals became impossible. Gravediggers were too weak to work, the ground too frozen to break. Mass graves were dug when possible, but more often, corpses simply piled up until spring thaw revealed them in the gutters. And yet, amid all this despair, something extraordinary happened. Leningrad did not collapse. The city did not surrender. Factories, though half-staffed and frozen, kept producing weapons. Workers dragged machinery by hand when there was no fuel. Schools continued classes, even if children fainted at their desks. Libraries stayed open, offering not just books but a warm place to sit for a few hours. Theaters staged performances, musicians played concerts, and poets read verses to audiences wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the frozen air. Why? Why keep reading, singing, performing, when there was hardly strength to stand? Because these acts were more than distraction. They were declarations of life. To read a book, to hear a sonata, to watch a play, was to say, we are still human. We are not animals, not corpses waiting for the thaw. We have memory, imagination, and dignity. Even in hunger, we have souls. One of the most famous events of the siege came in August 1942, when the composer Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was performed in Leningrad itself. The score had been smuggled into the city. Musicians, many half dead from starvation, gathered to rehearse. Some had to be carried into the hall. Others collapsed between movements. And yet, on the appointed night, they performed the symphony in full. Loudspeakers broadcast the music across the city and even toward the German lines. A message written not in words but in sound. We are still here. That concert was not just music. It was defiance. It was hope. And it was survival of a different kind. The survival of spirit when the body was already near its limits. The road that sustained Leningrad was called the Road of Life. It crossed Lake Ladoga, frozen in winter, treacherous in summer. Trucks risked German bombs, ice cracks, and storms to bring flour, grain, and sometimes a few precious parcels of food. Children were evacuated this way, huddled in the backs of trucks as shells burst nearby. The road was never enough to save everyone, but it was enough to keep the city alive, just barely. When you listen to these fragments of lives, when you picture the endless cold, the silence broken only by artillery, you begin to understand the depth of human endurance. The people of Leningrad did not survive because they had strength beyond measure. They survived because they clung to small things, a crust of bread, a scrap of music, a neighbor's whispered word of comfort. Survival was not dramatic. It was daily. It was the decision to rise from bed when every muscle screamed no. It was the act of lighting a candle when darkness felt eternal. It was the refusal to surrender, not just to the enemy outside the walls, but to the despair inside their own hearts. This is only the beginning of the story. For nearly 900 days, Leningrad endured hunger, cold, and death. Families were torn apart, children left orphaned, neighborhoods erased. But through it all, the city held. The siege would become one of the longest and most devastating in recorded history, and yet also one of the most powerful testaments to what human beings can withstand. And as we leave this first chapter tonight, let us carry with us not only the image of suffering, but the quiet, stubborn light that flickered within it. Because in the darkest winters, in the hungriest nights, that flicker was enough to keep an entire city alive. When morning came in Leningrad, it came quietly. The sun rose pale and cold over rooftops dusted with snow, its light doing little to warm the frozen streets. People stirred in their apartments, wrapped in layers of rags and blankets, not because they had rested but because waking was unavoidable. For many, the first thought was not of work or family, but of food. Or rather, the lack of it. Hunger had become the defining rhythm of life. It was not an ordinary hunger, the kind that comes when a meal is delayed. It was a gnawing, constant presence, a hollow echo in the belly that never truly left. To be hungry in Leningrad was not a passing discomfort. It was a condition of existence. Each person clutched their ration card as though it were life itself, for in truth, it was. Without the small squares of paper, there was no bread, no flour, no hope. The cards were traded, stolen, forged, and counterfeited, their value higher than rubles or gold. Losing one was a death sentence. And yet, even with them, survival was not guaranteed. The rations shrank to pitiful portions. Bread weighed in crumbs. Oil measured in teaspoons. Sometimes, there was no meat at all. Only a gelatinous substitute made from bones ground to powder. Bakers stretched flour with sawdust and bran. The loaves were dark, damp, and heavy, yet people devoured them with trembling hands. Imagine standing in line for hours in the biting wind, waiting for your turn at the bakery. Around you, bodies swayed with weakness, eyes sunken, lips cracked from cold. Some fainted before reaching the counter. Some never rose again. And when at last your portion was handed over, it was smaller than you remembered, smaller than you hoped. And yet, it was everything. The black market thrived in the shadows of starvation. There were whispers of secret trades, jewelry for a sack of flour, a fur coat for a single tin of meat, a family heirloom for a handful of sugar. Desperation redefined value. Gold had no taste. Diamonds could not fill a stomach. But a crust of bread, a piece of sausage, these were treasures beyond price. Not all trades were honorable. There were those who preyed on the weak, who offered food in exchange for things unthinkable, who profited from the suffering of neighbors. And there were darker tales still, stories spoken in hushed voices, stories of people disappearing, of meat appearing in markets with no clear origin. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, crept into the city like a shadow no one wished to see but no one could deny. Arrests were made, cases recorded, yet the hunger was stronger than fear. Still, many resisted that darkness. Diaries tell of mothers giving their last ration to their children, of neighbors sharing scraps with the sick, of workers dragging each other to factories through snowdrifts because duty had not yet been extinguished. There was cruelty, yes, but there was also kindness, flickering like a candle in the wind. In the middle of this struggle, death was everywhere. Not sudden, dramatic death, but quiet fading. People simply slowed, weakened, and ceased. A man would fall in the street, his ration card still clutched in his frozen hand. A woman would not wake from her night's sleep, her body curled under blankets too thin to hold back the cold. Children stopped crying, too weak to make sound, their eyes wide and still. Those who remained alive faced an impossible task: what to do with the dead. Funeral traditions vanished. There were no coffins, no flowers, no ceremonies. Sometimes, there were no graves, only shallow pits or snow-covered mounds. Families dragged their loved ones on sleds to mass burial sites, too weak to cry, too numb to feel. The ground was too hard to dig deeply. Bodies lay half-covered until spring thaw revealed them once more. And yet, in this city of hunger and death, life persisted. Schools opened when possible, even if lessons were short and students fainted at their desks. Children, too light to walk far, scribbled in notebooks with stiff fingers, learning multiplication tables between air raids. Teachers whispered stories of history and literature, reminding young minds that there was more to the world than cold and emptiness. Factories continued to grind, producing weapons for the war effort. Men and women worked until their bodies failed, their strength consumed by machines louder than their own heartbeats. They collapsed beside conveyor belts, sometimes dead before they hit the floor, but production did not stop. The city was starving, but it was still fighting. Music, poetry, and art found strange places to bloom. In apartments, musicians tuned violins by candlelight, their strings brittle in the cold. Actors recited plays to audiences wrapped in layers of coats, each word a fragile echo of culture refusing to die. Painters sketched frozen landscapes with charcoal when paints were gone. The human spirit clung to expression, even when hands trembled too much to hold a brush. One diary entry tells of a boy who, after eating his meager ration, drew pictures of banquets. Tables full of bread, bowls of soup, mountains of sweets. He knew he would never eat them, but the act of imagining them gave him joy. Dreams became nourishment. Memory became survival. The authorities broadcast speeches on the radio, urging strength, reminding citizens that their suffering had meaning, that the enemy must be resisted at all costs. But for many, the true strength came not from speeches but from one another. A neighbor sharing half her bread. A stranger pulling another from the snow. A mother telling her child a story to distract him from the growl of his stomach. These were the real acts of resistance, the quiet rebellion against despair. Winter gave way to spring, and with it, new horrors. Snow melted, revealing streets littered with bones and corpses. The Never River thawed, its banks lined with the dead who had been left behind. The air grew heavy with the scent of rot. But the thaw also brought life. Trucks began again to cross Lake Ladoga. Supplies trickled in. The bread rations grew, by grams at first, then by ounces. It was still not enough, but it was something. The city had survived the first winter, though at a terrible cost. Hundreds of thousands had died. Entire families were gone. Blocks of apartments stood nearly empty, their silence broken only by the wind. Yet, those who lived carried with them the memory of hunger's deepest shadow, and the knowledge that survival, no matter how fragile, was still possible. And as the months stretched on, as battles raged at the city's edge, as air raid sirens wailed through the night, Leningrad endured. Each day was not a triumph, not a victory, but simply another step forward, another 24 hours stolen from the grip of death. That, in itself, was resistance. This was the rhythm of life under siege. Hunger, cold, silence, death, and yet survival. Not glorious, not easy, but stubborn. And as the siege dragged into its second year, this stubbornness became the very heartbeat of the city. By the time the second winter of the siege arrived, the people of Leningrad carried their hunger like an invisible weight. The first winter had been a shock, sudden and brutal, stripping away illusions of rescue. The second winter was different. It was no less deadly, no less cruel, but it was expected. The city had adapted to suffering, and in that adaptation there was a strange kind of endurance. The road of life across Lake Ladoga remained the fragile thread connecting Leningrad to the outside world. When the lake froze, trucks rumbled across its surface, headlights dimmed to avoid enemy aircraft. The drivers sat with doors unlatched, ready to leap out should the ice crack beneath them. Some did not escape. Their trucks plunged into the freezing water, cargo lost, lives ended in seconds. And yet, the convoys kept moving. Each load of flour or grain meant the difference between survival and collapse. On the return trips, the trucks carried children. Pale, thin, and silent, they huddled together in the dark, bundled in rags, listening to the ice groan under the wheels. Mothers kissed them goodbye at the departure points, unsure if they would ever meet again. Some children made it to safety in the east. Some perished on the lake. And some carried with them memories of Leningrad so seared into their minds that they would speak of little else for the rest of their lives. Inside the city, routines hardened into rituals. People learned how to pace their steps so as not to waste strength. They learned to eat bread in the tiniest of bites, stretching each ration across the day. They learned to save energy by staying in bed, conserving warmth beneath piled blankets and coats. Life became a series of strategies to conserve, to endure, to last until another morning came. Yet hunger changed more than the body. It changed the mind. Diaries reveal how people's thoughts narrowed until food became the only subject worth speaking of. Dreams were filled with meals from the past. Soup steaming on the table, roasted meats, sweet cakes. Neighbors gathered not to gossip, but to describe recipes that none of them would ever taste again. The memory of food became a form of torture and a form of comfort at once. And still, people found ways to keep their humanity intact. There were weddings, quiet and small, couples exchanging vows with no feast to follow, only a piece of bread broken between them. There were birthdays marked with a whispered song, a candle burning low in a jar. Even laughter was not entirely gone. It came suddenly, unexpectedly, perhaps at the sight of a neighbor bundled in layers so thick they could barely walk, or at the absurdity of a streetcar frozen mid-track, abandoned like a monument to better times. Laughter was brief, fragile, but it was proof that not everything had been taken. The authorities tried to impose order. Posters urged citizens to stay strong, to work harder, to remember their duty. Radio broadcasts carried speeches, sometimes music, sometimes readings of poetry. But the most powerful messages were not official. They were personal. A note left on a door saying, "I still have some bread, come share." A child's chalk drawing on a wall, showing a house with smoke rising from its chimney, though no houses had warmth. These small gestures mattered more than any propaganda. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked without rest, their own bodies weakened by hunger. Medicines ran out. Bandages were torn from old sheets. Operations were performed without anesthesia, without light. And still, they worked. For every life saved, a dozen were lost, but the effort continued. In the wards, people whispered prayers, though faith had been tested to breaking. Some cursed God, some begged him, and some chose to believe that survival itself was an answer, however silent. The city's cultural life, astonishingly, did not die. Writers kept journals, though their hands shook too badly to form neat letters. Painters created portraits of faces hollowed by hunger, capturing in charcoal and ink the truth that photographs could not. Musicians tuned instruments with frozen fingers, each note a triumph over silence. Art became both resistance and record, the proof that life persisted even when stripped to its barest form. Among the countless stories, some stand out like lights in the darkness. There was the librarian who opened her reading room every morning, though the building had no heat, no electricity. She believed that books could keep people alive, if not in body then in spirit. And people did come. They came to sit in chairs, to turn brittle pages, to lose themselves for a moment in other worlds. A starving man reading about distant lands was, for a brief time, more than his hunger. There was the worker who built a tiny stove from scrap metal, burning furniture and books to cook watery soup for his neighbors. He could have kept it for himself, but he shared it. He said that to eat alone was worse than to starve together. His act of generosity was remembered long after his name was forgotten. There was the teacher who gathered her pupils in the ruins of a classroom, blackboard cracked, windows shattered. She taught them not only reading and writing, but also endurance. She told them, "The city is still alive, and so are we. That is our lesson." Her voice, soft but steady, gave those children more than knowledge. It gave them hope. Of course, not all stories carried such light. There were crimes born of desperation. There were betrayals, thefts, and unspeakable acts committed in the name of survival. But even these, terrible as they were, revealed the extremes of human nature under pressure. In Leningrad, every decision was a choice between life and conscience, and sometimes conscience was the cost. The German artillery never ceased. Shells rained down on the city, destroying homes, killing civilians already too weak to flee. Fires swept through neighborhoods, fought not with hoses. There was no water, but with handfuls of snow. Children grew up with the sound of explosions as their lullaby, their games played among rubble. And still, the city lived. By the spring of 1943, the siege had lasted more than 500 days. For the outside world, Leningrad was a symbol. For those inside, it was simply life, narrowed, starved, yet stubbornly continuing. Families no longer asked when it would end. They asked only if they could endure one more day. The human body, remarkable in its resilience, adjusted in ways both astonishing and tragic. People who once weighed robust figures shrank to half their size. Cheeks hollowed, eyes grew enormous in gaunt faces. Hair fell out, skin cracked. And yet, some discovered strength even in frailty. A grandmother carrying water from the river, step by painful step, seemed more heroic than any soldier. A boy scavenging scraps of firewood kept his family warm for one more night. These were victories as real as any battlefield. There were also moments of eerie beauty. On clear nights, the stars shone so brightly over the darkened city that people said it felt as though the heavens leaned closer. The silence of snow-covered streets, broken only by distant gunfire, carried a strange, haunting peace. One woman wrote in her diary, "We are surrounded by death, and yet I have never felt the world so alive." Perhaps it was desperation speaking. Perhaps it was truth. As the siege stretched into its second year, survival became less about waiting for rescue and more about creating meaning in the waiting. People found rituals, lighting a candle at the same hour, writing a line of poetry each evening, sharing stories before sleep. These small patterns gave shape to time, transforming endless days into a sequence of moments. Without them, despair might have consumed everything. And through it all, the road of life carried its fragile promise. Convoys came and went, never enough, always dangerous. Every successful trip was a thread added to the fabric of endurance. Every loss was a tear in that same fabric. But the fabric held. By now, the world knew of Leningrad's suffering. Newspapers carried stories, governments issued statements, but no words could capture the daily reality. Only those inside the city understood the full weight of it. The hunger, the silence, the stubborn will to live. And as they faced another winter, they did so with the weary knowledge that survival was not guaranteed, but possible. The long winter's echo stretched across every street, every home, every heart. It was the sound of footsteps on snow, of teeth chattering in the cold, of stomachs growling in unison. But it was also the sound of voices, thin but unbroken, refusing to fall silent. It was the echo of a city that, against all reason, still lived. By the time the Siege of Leningrad entered its third year, time itself had changed meaning. The city no longer measured life in months or seasons, but in endurance, in the simple question of whether one could survive until tomorrow. For those who had endured the first terrible winters, survival had become both a miracle and a burden. Every day was borrowed time. Every day was another turn in a story that refused to end. Winter returned again, as it always did, with winds howling down the Neva and snow drifting into streets already scarred by shellfire. Houses leaned half-collapsed, their windows shattered, their walls blackened by fire. Factories still churned, though at half-strength, their machines groaning, their workers gaunt. The tram lines were broken, yet some trams still stood frozen in place, their metal shells rusting, like monuments to a city that once moved. The people wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of warmth remained. Blankets worn thin from overuse, coats patched with rags, scarves knitted from string, gloves with no fingers. Children wore boots too large for them, stuffed with paper to keep them from slipping. The sight was both pitiful and stubborn, a city determined to clothe itself against despair, even with nothing left to wear. The air was filled with two constant sounds, the dull thunder of distant artillery and the coughs of the starving. The coughs echoed through stairwells, through hospital wards, through schoolrooms that were barely schoolrooms anymore. They were not the coughs of sickness alone, but of weakness, of lungs too weary to resist the cold. By now, bread was more than food. It was symbol, memory, lifeline. Every gram mattered. People carried ration cards as though they were sacred texts. They wrapped them in cloth, hid them in boots, tied them to their wrists while they slept. To lose one was worse than losing a limb. It was the end. The bread itself was no longer bread as it once had been. It was dark, heavy, made from whatever could be found. Sawdust, bran, ground husks, even cellulose. Each loaf smelled faintly of glue, yet it was eaten with reverence, divided with trembling hands. Mothers cut it into the thinnest of slices, sharing among their children, often saving none for themselves. One mother wrote in her diary, "I cut the bread today into 6 pieces. They were so small they seemed like nothing, but the children looked at me as if I had given them gold." Meals became rituals. A tiny cube of bread pressed to the lips, chewed slowly, savored as long as possible. Hot water poured into a cup and called soup. Potato peels boiled into broth and called feast. The act of eating was not about satisfaction. It was about remembering that one was still alive, Death was no longer an event. It was background. It lingered in stairwells, in empty apartments, in the gaps between neighbors. Sometimes it came quietly, a person failing to rise from their bed. Sometimes it came in the street, a body collapsing into snow, eyes wide, hands clutching nothing. Children grew used to stepping around the still figures as they walked to fetch water from the never. The dead no longer shocked. They simply were. And yet, each death still left its mark. A chair left empty at a table. A voice missing from the nightly whispers in the dark. An apartment door that no longer opened. The city grew quieter with every passing week. Funerals no longer existed. There was no wood for coffins, no strength for processions, no energy for prayers. Bodies were dragged on sleds to mass graves. Often, they were only half covered, for the ground was frozen solid. In spring, the thaw revealed them once more, a reminder of how little the living could afford to care for the dead. And yet, astonishingly, culture refused to die. Even in starvation, people turned to music, to words, to art. It was as though the spirit demanded expression, even when the body had nothing left to give. Theaters opened for short performances, actors standing thin and pale beneath spotlights powered by weak generators. The audience sat wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the air, listening to voices reciting poetry or lines from old plays. For a moment, they were not starving citizens of a besieged city. They were part of something greater, the human story that stretched beyond their suffering. The radio broadcast concerts, sometimes live, sometimes recordings from before the siege. One of the most powerful moments came when Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, written for the city, was performed inside Leningrad itself in 1942, despite hunger and bombardment. The orchestra was so depleted that musicians had to be brought back from the front lines, half-starved themselves, to fill the seats. They could barely hold their instruments. Yet they played. The sound carried not just through the concert hall, but through loudspeakers into the city and beyond, even toward the enemy lines. It was a message: Leningrad lives. The children of Leningrad bore the siege in ways both innocent and profound. They played in rubble, using broken bricks as toys, their games punctuated by the howl of air raid sirens. They drew pictures of food, of warm houses, of tables set with feasts. Some had forgotten what such things looked like, yet they drew them anyway, guided by stories from their parents. Schools, when they functioned, were little more than gatherings in cold rooms. Teachers lectured through chattering teeth, chalk squeaking faintly against cracked blackboards. The children tried to listen, but their heads drooped, their stomachs growled too loudly. Still, the act of teaching continued. Learning itself was resistance. Some children were evacuated across Lake Ladoga, carried in trucks across the road of life. Their mothers sent them off with tears frozen on their cheeks, not knowing if they would survive the journey, not knowing if they would ever meet again. Many of those children grew up remembering that departure as the moment they lost their childhood forever. The road of life across Lake Ladoga remained the city's artery. It brought in flour, oil, sometimes canned food, though never enough. It carried out evacuees, children, and the wounded, though never all. The ice cracked beneath the weight of trucks. Some sank, disappearing into black water with a hiss. Others made it through, greeted by cheers from starving workers waiting at the warehouses. The drivers were heroes in silence. They knew every trip could be their last. They drove with windows open in case they had to leap from their cabs. They drove at night, with headlights dimmed, tracing paths by instinct and memory. And when they reached the far shore, they turned back again, carrying hope in one direction, loss in the other. The people of Leningrad lived in two worlds at once. There was the world of hunger, cold, and death. And there was the world of memory, of summers before the war, of tables filled with bread, of laughter on Nevsky Prospect, of music in warm apartments. To remember was painful, but to forget was worse. Diaries from the time show this struggle clearly. One woman wrote, "I try not to think of butter. I try not to think of cakes. But then I dream of them, and wake up crying." Another wrote, "The hardest part is not the hunger, but remembering that we once lived differently, that there was once abundance, that it is gone, Yet memory also gave strength. People whispered stories of festivals, of weddings, of days when the city was filled with music and flowers. These stories reminded them of why they endured. They endured so that such days might return. As the siege dragged on, the third winter pressed down like a weight too heavy to bear. By now, families had lost half their members, sometimes more. Entire apartment blocks were empty, their windows dark. The city was no longer simply starving, it was hollowing out. And yet, the survivors persisted. They fetched water from the never. They cut wood from ruined buildings. They patched clothes again and again until they were nothing but threads. They walked slowly, spoke softly, conserved every ounce of strength. But they also sang. They whispered lullabies to children. They recited poems. They wrote letters, even if there was no one to send them to. They looked at the stars, and they dreamed of spring. Time itself became heavy. Days dragged, indistinguishable from one another. Morning, noon, night. They blurred into a single grey existence. People no longer asked what day it was, but only whether they had the strength to see another. And yet, beneath the weight of endless days, there was a quiet defiance. The city did not surrender. The people did not surrender. They lived on, one breath after another, one crumb of bread after another, one heartbeat after another. The siege had not ended. The hunger had not ended. But neither had Leningrad. The city still breathed. It breathed in whispers, in coughs, in sighs, in the rustle of ration cards. It breathed in the footsteps of women carrying buckets of water, in the voices of children reciting lessons, in the notes of a violin trembling through the night. It breathed, and in breathing, it defied death. This was the story of Leningrad in its third year of siege. Not victory, not freedom, but survival. A survival so stubborn, so unyielding, that it became its own kind of triumph. And though the world outside waited for battles to shift, for armies to advance, for the siege to break, inside the city the truth was simpler. The people lived, and that was enough. For nearly 900 days, Leningrad had lived in shadow. The city had endured hunger, cold, silence, and loss, each day blending into the next with no promise of change. But history never stands still. Even in the darkest winters, rivers beneath the ice continue to flow. And so, while the people of Leningrad clung to survival, battles far beyond their streets were shifting the fate of the city. Far from the frozen apartments and empty kitchens, the land around Lake Ladoga shook with fire. The Red Army, exhausted but unbroken, pressed against German lines that had tightened around Leningrad like a noose. Every tree line, every stretch of marshland, every village had been turned into a fortress. The Germans believed the circle would never break. But the Soviet soldiers believed something else. That millions of starving people waited for them inside the city. That every step forward was not only a military gain but a lifeline. They marched through forests where snow reached their waists, dragging artillery by hand when no horses could move it. They crossed frozen rivers at night, their boots crunching softly on the ice as they prayed it would hold their weight. They built bridges under fire, hammered planks together as bullets snapped past their ears. And when ammunition failed, they fought with bayonets, with shovels, with bare hands if they had to. The sound of battle carried into the city. Civilians, huddled in their apartments, could sometimes hear the distant thunder of guns. It rolled across the frozen lake, a faint promise that the world beyond the blockade had not forgotten them. Some listened with fear, knowing that fighting could just as easily bring destruction as salvation. Others listened with hearts burning, whispering to each other that maybe, just maybe, the end was drawing closer. In January 1943, after weeks of brutal struggle, the impossible happened. The Soviet forces seized Schlisselburg, the ancient fortress town at the southern edge of Lake Ladoga. With its capture, the German stranglehold cracked open. A narrow corridor, scarcely 10 kilometers wide, now connected Leningrad to the rest of Soviet land. The siege was not over, not even close, but the city was no longer entirely alone. Inside Leningrad, the news spread faster than fire. People who had long since stopped believing in miracles wept openly. They clutched each other's hands and said words they had not dared to speak for nearly 2 years. We are connected again. The relief was not measured in statistics or speeches. It was measured in the sight of trains rolling slowly across the new lifeline, carriages filled with flour, meat, sugar, kerosene, medicine. The corridor was fragile, under constant German fire, but it was real. When the first shipments arrived, the smell of true bread returned to the city. Not the coarse, grey loaves laced with sawdust or ground husks, but bread made from flour. The portions were still small, but the taste was unforgettable. A nurse wrote in her diary, "Today, I ate bread that tasted like bread. I wanted to laugh and cry at once. I felt human again." That single word, human, carried more weight than all the propaganda posters plastered on the walls. Rations rose slowly, almost cautiously, as if the authorities feared to promise too much. But even a few extra grams gave people strength they had thought gone forever. Mothers were able to feed children without tearing their own share in half. Workers in the factories found the energy to keep machines running. The city began to breathe differently. It was still shallow, still strained, but it was breath all the same. The corridor did not only bring food in, it carried people out. Trains and trucks ferried thousands of civilians, especially children, to safer places in the east. For those who left, it was a bittersweet deliverance. They were torn from their families, uncertain if they would ever return. But they were alive, carried away from the nightmare of hunger and bombardment. For those who remained behind, the city grew emptier, quieter. Some apartments stood with only one old woman where once an entire family had lived. The absence was painful, but it also lightened the weight on the city's fragile resources. The fighting around the corridor never ceased. German artillery pounded it daily, seeking to cut the lifeline before it grew too strong. Soldiers defended it with their lives, knowing that each trainload meant survival for millions. Tracks were repaired under fire, frozen earth dug out with bare hands, bridges rebuilt in hours after being destroyed. It was not just a supply route. It was a vein, carrying blood back into a body that had been close to collapse. Within Leningrad itself, life changed in subtle ways. Factories that had been silent for lack of material began to stir again. Machines clattered, their rhythm weak at first, then steadier. Trams rolled once more along broken streets, bells ringing as if to announce that the city was not dead. Schools reopened in bombed-out buildings, teachers gathering thin children and reminding them that learning was also survival. Yet the siege was far from lifted. Bombs still fell. Shells still exploded across the neighborhoods. Starvation did not vanish overnight. Many were already too far gone to be saved. The hospitals overflowed with patients whose bodies could no longer respond even to real bread. Every day, funerals still wound through the streets, coffins carried on sleds. The struggle for survival continued, but now it was no longer a struggle without end. Hope itself became a form of nourishment. People began to dream again, cautiously, about futures beyond hunger. They spoke of gardens that might one day be replanted, of theaters that might one day reopen, of streets that might one day be rebuilt. They still whispered, still wary of disappointment, but the fact that they spoke at all was a sign of change. For the children who remained, the world seemed to brighten in small ways. A sweet boiled from real sugar appeared once more in a ration bag, and for a child who had known nothing but the bitterness of substitutes, it was a treasure beyond price. A glass of milk, rare and thin though it was, could make a boy beam with delight. Play returned in cautious forms. A ball of rags kicked across rubble, a skipping rope fashioned from twisted wire. These tiny joys echoed louder than the artillery. And yet, even in the midst of renewal, the city carried its scars. People were thinner than shadows, faces hollow, eyes enormous. The streets were filled with ruins, and behind every doorway, memories of hunger still lingered. No one forgot the winters when death had been more common than life. But now, there was light enough to see a future. The siege still stretched on, month after month, then another winter, then another spring. But the people of Leningrad were different now. They had survived the deepest night, and though the dawn was not yet full, the horizon glowed faintly with its promise. Each wagon load of flour, Each return of electricity, each tram's bell was a reminder. The circle was not unbreakable. The city, starved but unbroken, had been given a second breath. And with that breath came a determination fiercer than hunger, fiercer than cold. They would not only endure, they would outlast. The city had learned to live inside the blockade, as though it were the only world that could ever exist. It had grown used to hunger, to the long silence after each bombardment, to the sight of sleds carrying the dead down empty streets. And yet, outside the ruined walls, the front lines had been shifting. The Red Army had fought battle after battle, wearing the Germans down, reclaiming forests, villages, fields. Each step closer tightened pressure on the enemy who had once seemed immovable. The winters did not grow softer. Snow fell thick, winds scoured the riverbanks, ice split open roads and tracks. But the soldiers moved forward all the same, fueled by the knowledge that the city behind them still waited, still starved, still believed in them. The Germans, once so confident in their ring of steel, were beginning to lose their hold. Their supplies ran thin, their soldiers were worn, their command grew nervous. The circle around Leningrad, which had felt eternal, was beginning to tremble. Inside the city, people sensed it before they were told. They heard the changes in the artillery. The shells came less frequently, the rhythm grew less steady. They noticed the sky, fewer planes, fewer bombs. They saw the soldiers who passed through on leave, men whose eyes carried not only fatigue but also a new fire. Whispers moved again from mouth to mouth, careful, guarded, but stronger now than the year before. Perhaps the siege would not last forever. Perhaps it would truly end. In January 1944, the thunder returned in full. The Soviet armies launched their great offensive, striking the Germans with a force that shook the ground like an earthquake. Artillery lined the horizon, thousands of guns firing at once, their flashes painting the snow red and gold. The roar was so loud that within the city, windows rattled though they had no glass, only boards and paper stuffed in the frames. It was not the distant rumble people had grown used to. It was a storm, rolling closer with each hour. The Germans fought back with desperation, but the balance had shifted. Where once they had advanced with ease, now they retreated step by step, losing ground, losing men, losing hope. The swamps and forests that had slowed the Soviets now trapped the Germans in their flight. Villages they had held for 2 years fell in days. Rail lines that had carried ammunition to the blockade were cut one after another. The iron ring cracked wider and wider. In the city, the people waited, every hour stretched thin with suspense. They went about their lives, collecting rations, repairing roofs, sweeping rubble from staircases, but their hearts beat in rhythm with the guns outside. They felt the weight of history pressing close, as though the very stones of Nevsky Prospect leaned forward to listen. And then, the day came. The blockade was broken completely. On the morning of January 27, 1944, the last German positions around Leningrad collapsed. The circle that had strangled the city for 872 days was shattered. The siege, the longest in modern history, was over. The news swept the city like a wave. Church bells rang, even in towers that had been cracked by shells. Factory whistles shrieked. People poured into the streets despite the cold, despite the snow, despite their frailty. They embraced strangers, they wept, they lifted their thin arms in triumph. For the first time in nearly 2.5 years, the city felt free to breathe without fear of the noose tightening again. That night, the skies above Leningrad lit with celebration. A great display of fireworks rose over the Neva, red and green and gold bursting across the darkness. The thunder of explosions that for so long had meant death now meant life, meant joy, meant victory. People watched with faces tilted upward, tears freezing on their cheeks, unable to believe their eyes. Children pointed at the colors, their laughter thin but piercing after so many months of silence. It was not food, it was not warmth, it was not the return of the dead, but it was proof that the nightmare had ended. Yet freedom did not erase what had been endured. The streets were still filled with ruins. The cemeteries were heavy with graves, many unmarked, where thousands lay together in long trenches. Families were broken, names lost, homes gone. The survivors carried scars in their bodies, in their minds, in their souls. But they also carried pride, a pride deeper than words. They had not surrendered, they had not yielded, they had endured the unendurable. The world beyond the city would learn in time what had happened inside those walls. The hunger, the cold, the quiet heroism, the endless funerals. But the people of Leningrad did not need to be told. They had lived it. They had carried the weight of it every day, and now they carried the memory of it into peace. The siege was lifted, but its shadow never left. Even as food returned, even as trams ran again, even as theaters reopened and gardens were replanted, the memory of those 872 days lingered in every corner. Each loaf of bread was precious beyond measure. Each flame of a stove seemed like a miracle. Each gathering in a square felt like defiance against the silence that once smothered the city. For Leningrad, the end of the blockade was not only a victory of armies. It was the victory of a people who refused to be erased. Thin, starved, wounded, they had remained. And in their survival, they had turned suffering into resistance, silence into strength, endurance into triumph. The fireworks faded, the night grew still, the snow settled once more on the streets. But the city was different now. It was no longer only the city of hunger, or the city of sorrow. It was the city that had endured. The city that had broken the circle. And though decades would pass, though new generations would walk along the Neva, though new wars would scar other lands, the memory of those days would remain in stone, in song, in the unshakable heartbeat of Leningrad. The guns had fallen quiet. For the first time in nearly 3 years, the earth around Leningrad no longer trembled with bombardment. The blockade was lifted, the enemy driven back, the circle broken. Yet silence did not bring instant peace. It was heavy, vast, unsettling. The people of Leningrad walked through their streets as though in a dream, uncertain how to live without the rhythm of shells and hunger. Snow still covered the ruins. It lay across collapsed buildings, blanketed shattered tramlines, filled the blackened craters of bombs. But beneath that snow, the city stirred. Smoke rose again from chimneys where stoves had long been cold. Markets reappeared on corners where nothing had been sold for years. The sound of hammering began to echo, repairs, makeshift at first, then stronger, more deliberate. The city, thin as bone, scarred beyond measure, began to rebuild itself. The survivors carried their scars in silence. Every family had known loss, and every household had an empty chair. Some families were gone entirely, apartments left open to the wind, their windows broken, their doors unlatched. Those who remained avoided speaking of the hunger too directly. They had no need to. Each hollow face, each pair of worn hands, each cautious glance toward a bread line said enough. But when they ate bread now, real bread, they ate slowly, reverently, as though afraid it might vanish again. Children grew quickly in those days, their faces pale but their eyes enormous, looking always for reassurance. They played in courtyards filled with rubble, climbing over bricks and beams as if ruins were natural playgrounds. They skipped rope where bombs had fallen, sang songs where funerals had once passed. Their laughter, thin but insistent, was the clearest sign that life had not only endured but insisted on returning. Adults moved differently. They walked with caution, as if expecting the earth itself to betray them. They queued for rations with patience, even when food became more plentiful, as though discipline itself had become part of survival. They smiled rarely, but when they did, it was with a depth that carried both joy and pain at once. The city's culture, long muffled, began to breathe again. Theaters reopened with patched curtains, orchestras tuned broken instruments, poets stood before thin crowds and read verses heavy with memory. Music returned to halls where silence had been law. An audience could sit, half in coats and boots, hands still cold, and yet cry at the sound of a violin. It was not only entertainment, it was proof that Leningrad remained human, that its soul had not been starved away. Work to rebuild was endless. Bridges had to be remade, factories restored, whole neighborhoods cleared of wreckage. Women shoveled rubble beside men, children carried bricks beside soldiers. It was labor without pause, but the city embraced it, For every brick laid was defiance, every wall raised was a statement. We are here still. Memory lingered in every corner. The cemeteries stretched vast and silent, rows upon rows where thousands lay in common graves. Families came to stand over snow-covered mounds, searching for names, for some trace of the ones they had lost. Some wept openly, others stood rigid, others whispered prayers into the wind. The dead outnumbered the living, yet the living carried them forward in every step, every breath, every gesture. The survivors were marked in different ways. Some never let go of bread, always keeping a crust hidden in a pocket, even when food was plentiful again. Some could not bear the sound of fireworks, mistaking them for artillery. Some woke in the night at the memory of hunger gnawing at their bones. And some grew fierce, unyielding, carrying within them a fire that nothing could extinguish. The government called it victory, and victory it was. The blockade had been broken, the enemy pushed back, the city unbowed. But for the people, it was something deeper than victory. It was survival. It was the proof that they had faced the very edge of human endurance and had not fallen. It was the quiet pride of knowing that when history demanded the impossible, they had given it. Years passed, and the ruins turned slowly into streets again. Gardens were replanted, trams clattered, factories roared louder. Children born after the siege grew up hearing stories of what had been endured, stories that sounded more like legend than memory. They saw photographs of hollow faces, read diaries filled with hunger, walked past monuments raised in stone, and tried to imagine what their parents and grandparents had lived through. They could not fully grasp it, but they carried it all the same, woven into the identity of the city. For Leningrad would always be more than a city after the siege. It became a symbol, a word that carried hunger, sorrow, endurance, and defiance all at once. Its name was spoken with reverence, sometimes with disbelief, sometimes with awe. The world outside saw statistics, but the people inside remembered the silences, the empty streets, the whisper of sleds carrying the dead. They remembered the first taste of bread after 2 years of husks and sawdust. They remembered the sound of artillery replaced by the thunder of fireworks. They remembered the long night and the fragile light that finally returned. Life went on, as it always does. Children grew into adults, new buildings rose where old ones had fallen, factories built machines instead of weapons, theaters filled with laughter instead of silence. But beneath it all, the memory of the blockade pulsed like a second heartbeat. It was not forgotten, and it never could be. Even decades later, when the war had long since ended, when the scars of the city had been covered with glass and stone, when generations who had not seen the siege walked freely along the Neva, the memory remained. It was carried in stories, in songs, in monuments, in the very rhythm of the city. For the blockade was not only a past. It was a presence, a shadow, a reminder of what human beings could endure, and what they could survive. The people of Leningrad had been starved, frozen, bombarded, surrounded, but they had not been erased. They had endured hunger so vast it silenced language, endured winters so fierce they seemed to belong to another world, endured loss so great it defied counting. And still, when the circle broke, they stood. Thin, scarred, hollow-eyed, but standing. That was their triumph. Not only that the siege ended, not only that victory came, but that they had remained through it all. A city, a people, a heartbeat against the silence. And so, after the silence, came life again. Slow, fragile, imperfect, but life. Life that carried memory in every stone, every loaf of bread, every child's laughter. Life that whispered, always, through the streets of the city that had endured. We are here still. Time carried the city forward. The ruins were cleared, streets rebuilt, bridges restored. Children who had known only hunger and silence grew into adults beneath a sky no longer torn by artillery. Generations came who had never seen the blockade, who walked freely on Nevsky Prospect without imagining sleds passing with their quiet burdens. The city lived again, vibrant, crowded, noisy with the ordinary sounds of peace. And yet, beneath every step, memory remained. The survivors carried it in their bones, in the way they ate bread carefully, never wasting a crumb. In the way they paused at sudden silences, remembering a time when silence meant danger. In the way they counted their blessings not in riches, but in warmth, in food, in the company of others. Monuments rose, solemn and vast. Granite walls carved with names, eternal flames that burned through winter snow, statues that bowed in grief and pride. At Piskaryavska Cemetery, where 500,000 rested together, long mounds of earth stretched out like the ribs of the city itself. Visitors walked in silence there, young and old, listening to the wind, reading the words carved into stone. No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten. The dead had no need for monuments, they lived already in the hearts of the city, but still the stones stood, so that memory could pass into the hands of children yet unborn. Writers tried to capture it, painters tried to paint it, composers tried to give it music. And though no single work could hold all of it, each added a fragment. The hunger, the defiance, the silence, the endurance. Together, they formed something greater, the memory of Leningrad not as statistics, but as a living story. For what had happened was more than suffering. It was endurance beyond measure, a refusal to vanish, a strength that had carried the city through what should have been impossible. This was the legacy, the echo that remained. The survivors grew old. Their hair whitened, their hands slowed, their voices softened. Some spoke often of those years, determined that no detail be lost. Others stayed silent, holding memory deep within themselves, unwilling to reopen wounds. But all of them carried the same truth, that they had lived, and that those who had not must never be forgotten. The city itself became their witness. Streets rebuilt still bore scars in their stones. Buildings patched and plastered still held bullet marks in hidden corners. And the never, eternal and calm, flowed past as it always had, carrying reflections of fireworks, of morning processions, of quiet nights where hope had been thin as ice. Decades passed, and the world changed. Empires rose and fell, new wars came and ended, new names marked maps. But Leningrad, St. Petersburg once more, carried with it always that memory, as though the blockade had carved itself into the soul of the city forever. And so the story ends not in silence, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. The siege lifted, the city endured, the people remained. What was lost cannot return, but what was endured cannot be erased. In the rhythm of footsteps along Nevsky Prospect, in the laughter of children by the river, in the bread broken at a family table, in the whisper of wind through the cemetery pines, the memory speaks. It does not fade, it does not weaken, it does not vanish. It endures, as the city endured. The siege is over. The story rests, but the echo remains.